Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, of the Praise of Folly podcast. This is the fourth book in the Technological Dictatorship series, and the first book by H.G. Wells, The Open Conspiracy, A Blueprint for World Revolution. Introduction. The Open Conspiracy was Wells's blueprint for a world revolution. He regarded this book as his finished statement on the way the world ought to be ordered. Possibly he underestimated or ignored the fact that it is often in the interest of subsets of the human race to act against other subsets. Moreover, the emphasis on religion seems odd from a rationalist. After the First World War, observing the lack of knowledge of most people about most things, he turned to history. Starting in 1918, his Outline of History, first published in parts with gorgeous covers, when in 1920 as a 2-volume work, included color plates of lavish nature for the time. In effect, it was jointly authored. His chapters were sent to collaborators, and the resulting multiple corrections reassembled by the Dilly, Chase, and Wells. A popular 1-volume edition appeared in 1930. By the standards of its time, this was a bestseller. It was praised decades later by H.A.P. Taylor as still the best introduction to history. Toynbee had a favorable opinion of it. During the 1920s, it sparked controversy with Hilaire Belloc, who believed in such things as the fall of man. It was also attacked by a teacher of Greek. Wells hoped that school history could be taught in an international sense, still, of course, have not come to fruition. He planned and collaborated a hefty set of volumes on biology, the science of life, with his own son, with Julian Huxley. The theme was largely evolutionary. The Origin of Species was published only a few years before his birth. Huxley, a descendant of T.H. Huxley, regards Wells as something of a Cockney upstart. And he wrote a descriptive rather than analytical book on economics, which includes many ingenious observations, but was eclipsed by Keynes's general theory of 4 years later. Some of his books were filmed. His Invisible Man was turned into a film script by Preston Sturges, who, however, regarded his book as not very filmable and infuriated Wells by making the Invisible Man mad. Another media incident was Orson Welles' broadcast of War of the Worlds in 1938, involving aggressive Martians landing in a location Americanized from its original Surrey, and which was reported to have caused mass panic among less educated Americans on the eastern seaboard. C.P. Snow writes of Wells that he could throw out a phrase that crystallized the whole argument, and that he never heard anyone remotely in the same class. Among these phrases were the war that will end war, coined when he worked with the Ministry of Propaganda under Norfolk during the First World War, which he supported, and the New World Order, which seems to be the first to use or popularize in a 1940 book of that time. His less successful phrases included the competent receiver. He said of himself that he worked all the time. He was a socialist of an empirical rather than vague rationalist type, disliking Marx and unenthusiastic about the managerial socialism of Webb's. His book, The Open Conspiracy, was published in 1928, subtitled Blueprints for a World Revolution. Bertrand Russell said of his book, "I do not know of anything which I agree more entirely, though since this was in a beginning letter, perhaps he was just being polite." It was revised and republished as What Are We to Do with Our Lives in 1931. In this short book, Wells attempts to answer the question, what should a socialist actually do, to which he confessed several times to having no very clear idea. It's a counter to Marx, Why Shouldn't Non-Proletarians Unite to Change the World? Chapter 1, The Present Crisis in Human Affairs. The world is undergoing immense changes. Never before have the conditions of life changed so swiftly and enormously as they have changed for mankind in the last 50 years. We have been carried along with no means of measuring the increasing swiftness in the succession of events. We are only now beginning to realize the force and strength of the storm of change that has come upon us. These changes have not come upon our world from without. No meteorite from outer space has struck our planet. There have been no overwhelming outbreaks of volcanic violence or strange epidemic diseases. The sun has not flared up to excessive heat or suddenly shrunken to plunge us into Arctic winter. The changes have come through men themselves. Quite a small number of people, heedless of the ultimate consequences of what they did, one man here and a group there, have made discoveries and produced and adopted inventions that have changed all the condition of social life. We are now just beginning to realize the nature of these changes, to find words and phrases for them and put them down. First, they begin to happen, and then we begin to see that they were happening. And now we are beginning to see how these changes are connected together and to get the measure of their consequences. We are getting our minds so clear about them that soon we shall be able to demonstrate them and explain them to our children in our schools. We do not do so at present. We do not give our children a chance of discovering that they live in a world of universal change. What are the broad lines upon which the alterations of conditions are proceeding? It will be most convenient to deal with them in the order in which they came to be realized and seen clearly rather than by the order in which they came out or by their logical order. They are more or less interdependent changes. They overlap and interact. It was only in the beginning of the 20th century that people began to realize the real significance of that aspect of our changing conditions to which the phrase the abolition of distance has been applied. For a whole century before that, there have been continual increase in the speed and safety of travel and transport, and the ease and swiftness with which messages could be transmitted. But this increase had not seemed to be a matter of primary importance. Various results of railway, steamship, and telegraph became manifest. Towns grew larger, spreading into the countryside. Once inaccessible lands became areas of rapid settlement and cultivation. Industrial centers began to live on imported food. News from remote parts lost its time lag and tended to become contemporary. But no one hailed these things as being more than improvements in existing conditions. They are not observed to be the beginnings of a profound revolution in the life of mankind. The attention of young people was not drawn to them, nor attempt was made or considered necessary to adapt political and social institutions to this creeping enlargement of scale. Until the closing years of the 19th century, there was no recognition of the real state of affairs. Then a few observant people began, in a rather tentative and commentary sort of way, to call attention to what was happening. They did not seem to be moved by the idea that something had to be done about it. They merely remarked brightly and intelligently that it was going on, and then they went on to the realization that this abolition of distance was only one aspect of a much more far-reaching advances. Men were traveling about so much faster and furnishing their communications instantly about the world because a progressive conquest of force and substance was going on. Improved transport was only one of a number of portentous consequences of that conquest. The first to be conspicuous and set men thinking, but not perhaps the first in importance. It dawned to them that in the last 100 years there had been a stupendous progress in obtaining and utilizing mechanical power, a vast increase in the efficiency of mechanism, and associated with that an enormous increase in the substances available for man's purposes, from vulcanized rubber to the modern steels, and from petroleum and margarine to tungsten and aluminum. At first, the general intelligence was disposed to regard these things as lucky finds, happy chance discoveries. It was not apprehended that the shower of finds was systematic and continuous. Popular writers told about these things, but they told of them as wonders like the pyramids, the Colossus of Rhodes, and the Great Wall of China. Do you realize how much more they were than wonders? The 7 wonders of the world left men free to go on living, toiling, marrying, and dying as they had been accustomed to for immemorial ages. If the 7 wonders had vanished or had been multiplied 30 score, it would not have changed the lives of any large portion of human beings. But these new powers and substances were modifying and transforming unobtrusively, surely, and relentlessly, very particular of the normal life of mankind. They increased the amount of production and the methods of production. They made possible big business to drive the small producer and the small distributor out of the market. They swept away factories and invoked new ones. They changed the face of the fields. They brought into the normal life things, thing by thing and day by day, electric light and heating. Bright cities at night, better aeration, new types of clothing, a fresh cleanliness. They changed a world where there had never been enough into a world of potential plenty, into a world of excessive plenty. It dawned upon their minds after the realization of the abolition of distance that shortage of supplier had also been abolished and that irksome toil was no longer necessary to produce anything material that man might require. It is only in the last dozen years that this broader and profounder fact has come through to the intelligence of any considerable number of people. Most of them have still to carry their realization a step further and see how complete is the revolution in the character of the daily life these things involve. But there are still other changes outside this vast advance in the pace and power of material life. The biological sciences have undergone a corresponding extension. Medical art has attained a new level of efficiency, so that in all the modernizing societies of the world, the average life is prolonged. And there is, in spite of a great fall in the birth rate, a steady alarming increase in the world's population. The proportion of adults alive is greater than it has ever been before. Fewer and fewer human beings die young. This has changed the social atmosphere about us. The tragedy of lives cut short and ended prematurely is passing out of general experience. Health becomes prevalent. The continual toothaches, headaches, rheumatism, neuralgias, coughs, colds, and indigestions that made up so large a part of earlier lives of our grandfathers and grandmothers fade out of experience. We may live now, we may discover without any great burden of fear, wholesomely and abundantly for as long as the desire to live is in us. But we do not do so. All this possible freedom of movement, this power and abundance remains for most of us no more than a possibility. There is a sense of profound instability about the achievements of our race, even those who enjoy without security. And for the great multitude of mankind, there is neither ease, plenty, nor freedom. Hard tasks, insufficiency, and unending money worries are still the ordinary stuff of life. Over everything human hangs the threat of such war as man has never known before. We're armed and reinforced by all the powers and discoveries of modern science. When we demanded why the achievements of power turned to distress and danger in our hands, we get some very unsatisfactory replies. The favorite platitude of the politicians, excusing himself for the futilities of his business, is that moral progress has not kept pace with material advance. That seems to justify him completely, but it can justify no other intelligent person. He says moral. He leaves that word unexplained. Apparently, he wants to shift the responsibility to our religious teachers. At the most, he has made the vaguest gesture towards a reply, and yet, when we consider it charitably and sympathetically, there just seems to be a germ of reality in that phrase of his. What does moral mean? Moral means manners and customs. Morality is the condition of life. It is what we do with our social lives. It is how we deal with ourselves in relation to our fellow creatures. And there does seem to be a much greater discord now than there was, say, a couple of 100 years ago between the prevailing idea of how to carry on life and the opportunities and dangers of the time. We are coming to see more and more plainly that certain established traditions which have made up the frame of human relationships for ages are not merely no longer as convenient as they were, but are positively injurious and dangerous. And yet at present we do not know how to shake off these traditions, these habits of social behavior which rule us. Still less are we able to state, and still less bring into operation the new conceptions of conduct and obligation that must replace them. For example, the general government of human affairs has hitherto been distributed among a number of sovereign states. There are about 70 of them now, and until recently that was quite a tolerable system of framework into which a general way of living could be fitted. The standard of living may not have been as high as our present standards, but the social stability and assurance were greater. The young were trained to be loyal, law-regarding, patriotic, and a defined system of crimes and misdemeanors with properly associated pains, penalties, and repressions kept the social body together. Everyone was taught a history of glorifying his own state, and patriotism was chief among the virtues. Now, with great rapidity, there has been that abolition of distance, and everyone has become next-door neighbor to everyone else. States once separate social and economic systems formerly remote from each other now jostle each other exasperatingly. Commerce under the new conditions is perpetually breaking nationalist bounds and making militant raids upon the economic life of other countries. This exacerbates patriotism, in which we have all been trained and with which we are all, with scarcely an exception, saturated. And meanwhile, war, which was once a comparative slow bricking upon a front, has become war in three dimensions. It gets at the non-combatant almost as searchingly as the combatant, and has acquired weapons of stupendous cruelty and destructiveness. At present, there exists no solution to this paradoxical situation. We are continually being urged by our training and traditions to antagonisms and conflicts that will impoverish, starve, and destroy both our antagonists and ourselves. We are all trained to distrust and hate foreigners, salute our flags, stiffen up in a wooden, obedient way at our national anthem, and prepare to follow the little fellows in spurs and feathers who pose as the heads of our state into the most horrible common destruction. Our political and economic ideas of living are out of date, and we find great difficulty in adjusting them and reconstructing them to meet the huge and strenuous demands of the new times. This is really what our gramophone politicians have in mind, in the vague way in which they have anything in mind when they put on that well-worn record about moral progress not having kept up with material inventions. Socially and politically, we want a revised system of ideas about conduct, a view of social and political life brought up to date. We are not doing the effective thing with our lives. We are drifting. We are being hoodwinked and bamboozled and misled by those who trade upon old traditions. It is preposterous that we should still be followed about and pestered by war, taxed for war preparations, and threatened bodily and in our liberties by this unnecessary and exaggerated, distorted survival of the disunited world of the pre-scientific era. And it is not simply that our political way of living is now no better than an inherited defect and malformation, but that our everyday life, our eating and drinking and clothing and housing and going about, is also cramped, thwarted, and impoverished because we do not know how to set about shaking off the old ways and fitting the general life to our new opportunities. The strain takes the form of increased unemployment and dislocation of spending power. We do not know whether to spend or to save. Great swarms of us find ourselves unaccountably thrown out of work. Unjustly, irrationally, colossal business reconstructions are made to increase production and accumulate profits, and meanwhile the customers with the purchasing power dwindle in numbers and fade away. The economic machine creaks and makes every sign of stopping, and its stopping means universal want and starvation. It must not stop. There must be a reconstruction, a changeover, but what sort of changeover? Though none of us are yet clear as to the precise way in which the great changeover is to be effected, there is a worldwide feeling now that the changeover or a vast catastrophe is before us. The increasing multitudes participate in that uneasy sense of insecure transition. In the course of one lifetime, mankind has passed from a state of affairs that seems to us now to have been slow, dull, ill-provided, and limited, but at least picturesque and tranquil-minded, to a new phase of excitement, provocation, menace, urgency, and actual or potential distress. Our lives are part of one another. We cannot get away from it. We are items in a social mass. What are we to do with our lives? Chapter 2, The Idea of the Open Conspiracy. I am a writer upon social and political matters, especially I am a very ordinary, undistinguished person. I have a mediocre brain, a very average brain, and the way in which my mind reacts to these problems is therefore very much the way in which most brains will react to them. But because it is my business to write and think about the questions, because on that account I am able to give more time and attention to them than most people, I am able to get rather ahead of my equals and to write articles and books just a little before the ideas I experienced became plain to scores of thousands, and then to hundreds of thousands, and at last to millions of other people. And so it happened that a few years ago, round about 1927, I became very anxious to clear up and give form to a knot of suggestions that seemed to me to have in them the solution of the riddle of adapting our lives to the immense new possibilities and the immense new dangers that confront mankind. It seemed to me that all over the world, intelligent people were waking up to the indignity and absurdity of being endangered, restrained, and impoverished by a mere uncritical adhesion to traditional governments, traditional ideas of economic life, and traditional forms of behavior. And that these were awaking intelligent people must constitute first a protest and then a creative resistance to the inertia that was stifling and threatening us. These people, I imagine, would say first, we are drifting, we are doing nothing worthwhile with our lives. Our lives are dull and stupid and not good enough. Then they would say, what are we to do with our lives? And then let us get together with the other people of our sort and make over the world into a great worldwide civilization that will enable us to realize the promises and avoid the dangers of this new time. It seemed to me that as one after another we woke up, that is what we should be saying. It amounted to a protest, first mental and then practical. It amounted to a sort of unpremeditated and organized conspiracy against the fragmentary and insufficient governments and the widespread greed, appropriation, clumsiness, and waste that we are now going on in. But unlike conspiracies in general, this widening protest and conspiracy against established things would be by its very nature go on in the daylight, and it would be willing to accept participation and help from every quarter. It would, in fact, become an open conspiracy, a necessary, naturally evolved conspiracy to adjust our dislocated world. I made various attempts to develop this idea. I published a little book called The Open Conspiracy as early as 1928, into which I put what I had in my mind at the time. It was an unsatisfactory little book. Even when I published it, it is not quite plain enough and not quite confident enough, and evidently unsure of its readers. I could not find out how to do it better at the time, and it seemed in its way to say something of a living and current interest, and so I published it. But I arranged things so that I could withdraw it in a year or so. That I did, and this present book is largely a rewritten version, much clearer and more explicit. Since that first publication, we have all got forward surprisingly. Events have hustled along and been hustled along by thought. The idea of reorganizing the affairs of the world on a quite a big scale, which was utopian, and so forth in 1926 and 1927, and still bold in 1928, has now spread about the world until nearly everybody has it. It is broken out all over the place, thanks largely to the mental stimulation of the Russian 5-year plan. Hundreds of thousands of people everywhere are now thinking upon the lines foreshadowed by my open conspiracy, not because they had ever heard of the book or phrase, but because that was the way things thought was going. The first open conspiracy conveyed the general idea of a world reconstructed, but it was very vague about the particular way in which this or that individual life could be lived in relation to that general idea. It gave a general answer to the question, what are we to do with our lives? It said, help to make over the new world amidst the confessions of the old. But when the question was asked, what am I to do with my life? The reply was much less satisfactory. The intervening years of thought and experience make it possible now to bring this general idea of reconstructive effort and attempt to build up a new world within the dangers and disharmonies of our present state into a much closer and more explicit relation to the individual open conspirator. We can present the thing in a better light and handle it with a surer torch. Chapter 3, we have to clear and clean up our minds. Now, one thing is fairly plain to most of us. We are waking up to the need of living our lives in a new way and making over the state, which is the framework of our lives, to meet the new demands upon it, and that is that we have to put our own minds in order. Why we have only awakened now to this crisis in human affairs? The changes in progress have been going on with a steady acceleration for a couple of centuries. Clearly, we all must have been very unobservant. Our knowledge, as it came to us, must have been very badly arranged in our minds, and our way of dealing with it must have been cloudy and muddled, or else we should surely have awakened long ago to the immense necessities that now challenge us. And if that is so, if it has taken decades to rouse us, then quite probably we are not yet completely awake. Even now, we may not have realized the job before us in its completeness. We may still have much to get plain in our minds, and we certainly have much more to learn. One primary and permanent duty, therefore, is to go on with our thinking and to think as well as we can about the way in which we think and about the ways in which we get and use knowledge. Fundamentally, the open conspiracy must be an intellectual rebirth. Human thought is still very much confused by the imperfection of the words and other symbols it employs, and the consequences of this confused thinking are much more serious and extensive than is commonly realized. We still see the world through a mist of words. It is only the things immediately about us that are plain fact. Through symbols, and especially through words, man has raised himself above the level of an ape and come to a considerable mastery over the universe. But every step in his mental ascent has involved entanglement with these symbols and words he was using. They were at once helpful and very dangerous and misleading. A great part of our affairs, social, political, and intellectual, is in a perplexing and dangerous state today because of our loose, uncritical, slovenly use of words. All through the later Middle Ages, there were great disputes among the schoolmen about the use of words and symbols. There is a queer disposition in the human mind to think that symbols and words and logical deductions are truer than actual experiences. And these great controversies were due to the struggle of the human intelligence against that disposition. On the other side were the realists, who were so called because they believed in effect that names were more real than facts. And on the other side were the nominalists, who were from the first were pervaded by a suspicion about names and words generally, who thought there might be some sort of catch in verbal processes, and who gradually worked their way towards verification by experiment, which is the fundamental thing about experimental science. Experimental science, which has given our human world all these immense powers and possibilities that tempt and threaten today. These controversies of the schoolmen were of the utmost importance to mankind. The modern world could not begin to come into existence if the human mind had broken away from the narrow-minded verbalist way of thinking which the realists followed. But all through my education, I never had this matter explained to me. The University of London intimated that I was a soundly educated young man by giving me a degree in a first-class honors and the liberty to acquire and wear an elegant gown and hood. And the London College of Precipitators gave me and the world its highest assurances that I was fit to educate and train the minds of my fellow creatures. And yet I had to still discover that a realist was not a novelist who put a rather too highly flavored sex appeal into his books, and a nominalist nothing in particular. But it had crept into my mind as I learned about individuality in my biological work, and about logic and psychology in my preparation as the preceptor, that something very important and essential was being left out, and that I wasn't at all as well equipped as my diplomas presently said I was. And in the next few years, I found the time to clean up this matter pretty thoroughly. I made no marvelous discoveries. Everything I found was already known. Nevertheless, I had to find out some of this stuff for myself quite over again, as though it had never been done. So inaccessible was any complete account of human thinking to an ordinary man who wanted to get his mind into proper thinking condition. And this was not that I had missed some recondite, precious refinement of philosophy. It was that my fundamental thinking at the very root of my political and social conduct was wrong. I was in a human community, in that community, and I was with it. Was thinking of phantoms and fantasies as though they were real and living things, was in a reverie of unrealities, was blind, slovenly, hypnotized, base, and ineffective, blundering about in an extremely beautiful and extremely dangerous world. I set myself to re-educate myself, and after the practice of writers wrote it in various trial pamphlets, essays, and books. There is no need to refer to these books. The gist of the matter is set out in 3 compilations, which I shall refer again almost immediately. There are the Outline of History, the Science of Life, and the Work, Health, Wealth, and Happiness of Mankind. In the last, it is shown quite plainly how man has had to struggle over the mastery of his mind, has discovered only after great controversies the proper and effective use of his intellectual tools, and has had to learn to avoid certain widespread traps and pitfalls before he could achieve his present mastery over matter. Thinking clearly and effectively does not come by nature. Hunting the truth is an art. We blunder naturally into 1,000 misleading generalizations and false processes. Yet there is hardly any intelligent mental training done in the schools of the world today. We have to learn this art if we are to practice it at all. Our school teachers have had no proper training themselves. They miseducate by example and precept, and so it is that our press and current discussions are more like an impromptu riot of crippled and deaf and blind minds than an intelligent interchange of ideas. What bosh one reads, what rash and impudent assumptions, what imbecile inferences. But re-educated by re-educating oneself, getting one's mind into health and exercising it and training it to think properly is only the beginning of the task before the awakened open conspirator. He has not only to think clearly, but he has to see that his mind is equipped with the proper general ideas to form a true framework for his everyday judgments and decisions. It was the Great War first brought home to me how ignorant I was and how ill-finished and untidy my mind was about most important things of life. That disastrous waste of life, material, and happiness, since it was practically worldwide, was manifestly the outcome of the process that constituted the bulk of history. And I found that I did not know, and nobody else seemed to know, history in such a fashion as to be able to explain how the Great War came about or what ought to come out of it. Versailles, we all seem to be agreed nowadays, was silly. And how could Versailles be anything else than what it was in view of the imperfect, lopsided historical knowledge and the consequent suspicion, emotion, and prejudice of those who assembled there? They did not know any better than the rest of us what the war was, and so how could they know what the peace ought to be? I perceived that I was in the same case with everyone else, and I set myself, first of all, for my own guidance, to make a summary in all history and get some sort of map to more serviceable conclusions about the political state of mankind. This summary I made was the Outline of History, a shameless compilation and arrangement of the main facts of the world story, written without a touch of art or elegance. Written indeed in a considerable hurry and excitement, and its sale, which is now in the 3rd million, showed how much I had in common with the great dispersed crowd of ordinary people, all wanting to know, all disgusted with the patriotic, litigious, twaddling, gossipy stuff given them as history by their schoolmasters and schoolmistresses, which has led them into the disaster of the war. The Outline of History is not a whole history of life. Its main theme is the growth of human intercommunication, human communities, and the rulers and conflicts. The story of how and why the myriads of little tribal systems of 10,000 years ago have fought and coalesced into the 60 or 70 odd governments of today, and are now straining and laboring in the grip of forces that must presently accept their final unison. And even as I completed the outline, I realized that they remain outside its scope, wider and more fundamental and closer, more immediate fields of knowledge, which I still had to get in order for my own practical ends and the ends of like-minded people who wanted to use their lives effectively if my existence was to escape futility. I realized that I did not know enough about the life in my body and its relations to the world of life, and a matter outside it to come to proper decisions about a number of urgent matters, from race conflicts, birth control, and my private life, to the public control of health and the conservation of natural resources. And also I found I was astonishingly ignorant about the everyday business of life. The how and the why of the miner who provided the coal to cook my dinner, and the banker who took my money in return for a checkbook, and the shopkeeper from whom I bought things, and the policeman who kept the streets in order for me. Yet I was voting for laws affecting my relations with these people, paying them directly or indirectly, airing my ignorant opinions about them, and generally contributing by my behavior to sustain and affect their lives. So with the aid and discretion of two very competent biologists, I set to work to get out as plain and clear a statement as possible of what was known about the sources and nature of life and the relation of species to individuals and to other species and the processes of consciousness and thought. This I published as The Science of Life, and while this was going on, I set myself to the task of making a review of all human activities in relation to each other, the work of people and the needs of people, cultivation, manufacture, trade, direction, government, and all. This was the most difficult part of the attempt to get a rational account of the modern world, and it called for the help and counsel of a great variety of people. I had to ask and find some general answer to the question, what are the 1900 odd million human beings who are alive today doing, and why are they doing it? It was in fact an outline of economic, social, and political science, but since after the outline of history, the word outline had been a good deal cheapened by various enterprising publishers, I have called it the work, wealth, and happiness of mankind. Now I find by getting these three correlated compilations into existence, I have at last, in however rough a fashion, brought together a complete system of ideas upon which an open conspirator can go. Before anyone could hope to get on to anything like a practical working directive answer to what are we to do with our lives, it was necessary to know what our lives were, the science of life, which had led up to the present pattern, the outline of history, and this third book to tell what we are actually doing and supposed to be doing with our working lives day by day at the present time. By the time I was through with these books, I felt I had really something sound and comprehensive to go upon, an ideology, as people say, on which it was possible to think of building a new world without fundamental surprises, and moreover, that I had got my mind stripped down and cleaned of many illusions and bad habits, so that I could handle life with an assurance it had never known before. There is nothing marvelous about these compilations of mine. Any writer of average intelligence with the same will and the same resources who could devote about 9 or 10 years to the task and get the proper sort of help could have made them. It can be done and is no doubt being done all over again by other people for themselves and perhaps for others much more beautifully and adequately. But to get that amount of vision and knowledge, to achieve that general arrangement and understanding was a necessary condition that had to be satisfied before any answer to the question, what are we to do with our lives, could even be attempted, and before one could become an effective way an open conspirator. There is nothing indispensable even now, I repeat, about these three particular books. I know about them and refer to them because I put them together myself, and so they are handy for me to explain myself. But most of what they contain can be extracted from any good encyclopedia. Any number of people have made similar outlines of history for themselves, have read widely, grasped the leading principles of biology, and grappled with the current literature of business science, and do not in the least need my particular summary. So far as history and biology are concerned, they are parallel books that are as good and serviceable. Von Loon's books, for example, yet even for highly educated people, these summaries may be useful in bringing things known with different degrees of thoroughness into a general scheme. They correlate and fill up the gaps. Between them, they cover the ground, and in some fashion, that ground has to be covered before the mind of the modern citizen is prepared to tackle the problems that confront him. Otherwise, he is an incapable citizen. He does not know where he is and where the world is, and if he is rich or influential, he may be a very dangerous citizen indeed. Presently, there will be far better compilations to meet this need, or perhaps the gist of all the three divisions of knowledge, concentrated and made more lucid and attractive, may be available as the intellectual frame of modern education throughout the world as a general account of life that should be given to everyone. But generally, no one can possibly set about living properly and satisfactorily unless he knows what he is, where he is, and how he stands to the people and things around him. Chapter 4, The Revolution in Education. Some sort of reckoning therefore, between people awakened into the new world that dawns about us and the schools, colleges, and machinery of formal education is overdue. As a body, the educated are getting nothing like the account of life which is needed to direct our conduct in this modern world. It is a crying absurdity in the world today that these institutions should go through a solemn parade of preparing the new generation for life, and that then, afterwards, a minority of their victims, finding this preparation has left them totally unprepared, should have their own accord to struggle out of a world heap of starved and distorted minds to some sort of real education. The world cannot be run by such a minority of escaped and re-educated minds alone, with all the rest of the heap against them. Our necessities demand the intelligence and services of everyone who can be trained to give them. The new world dominates new schools, therefore, to give everyone a sound and thorough mental training and equip everyone with clear ideas about history, about life, and about political and economic relationships, instead of the rubbishy head content at present prevalent. The old world teachers in schools have to be reformed or replaced. A vigorous education reform movement arises as a natural and necessary expression of the awakened open conspirator. A revolution in education is the most imperative and fundamental part of the adaptation of life to its new conditions. These various compendia of knowledge constituting a modern account of life on which we have laid stress in the previous sections, these supplements to teaching which are now produced and read outside the established formal educational world and in the teeth of its manifest hostility, arise from the backwardness of that world, and as that world yields slowly but surely to the pressure of the new spirit, so they will permeate and replace its textbooks and disappear as a separate class of book. The education these new dangerous times in which we are now living demands must start right from the beginning, and there must be nothing to replace and nothing to relearn in it. Before we can talk politics, finance, business, and morals, we must see that we have got the right mental habits and the right foundation of realized facts. There is nothing much to be done with our lives until we have seen to that. Okay, chapter 5, Religion in the New World. Yes, objects the reader, but does not our religion tell us what we are to do with our lives? We have to bring religion as its fundamental matter into this discussion. From our present point of view, religion is that essential part of education which determines conduct. Religion certainly should tell us what we do with our lives, but in the vast stir and occasions of modern life, so much of what we call religion remains irrelevant or dumb. Religion does not seem to join on to the main parts of the general problem of living. It has lost touch. Let us try and bring the problem of the open conspiracy to meet and make the new world into revelation with the traditions of religion. The clear-minded open conspirator who has got his modern ideology has lucidly arranged an account of the universe in order is obliged to believe that only by giving his life to the great process of social reconstruction and shaping his conduct with reference to that can he do well with his life. But that merely launches him into the most subtle and unending of struggles, the struggle against incessant gravitation, or interest to ourselves. He has to live the broad life and escape from the close, narrow life. We all try to attain the dignity and happiness of magnanimity and escape from the tormenting urgencies of personal life. In the past, that struggle has generally assumed the form of religious struggle. Religion is the antagonist of self. In their complements in the life that was professionally religious, religions have always demanded greater subordination of self. Therein lay their creative force. They demanded devotion and gave reasons for that demand. They disentangled the will from the egotistic preoccupations often very completely. There is no such thing as a self-contained religion, a private religio solo. Certain forms of Protestantism and some mystical types come near to making religion secluded duet between the individual and his divinity, but here that may be regarded as a perversion of the religious impulse. Just as the normal sexual impulse excites and stirs the individual out of his egotism to serve the ends of the race, so the normal religious process takes the individual out of his egotism for the service of the community. It is not a bargain. A social contract between the individual and the community is a subordination of both the existing individual and the existing community in relation to something, a divinity, a divine order, a standard, a righteousness more important than either. What is called in the phraseology of certain religious conviction of sin and the flight from the city of destruction are familiar instances of this reference of the self-centered individual of the current social life to something far better than either the one or the other. This is the third element in the religious relationship, a hope or a promise, an objective, which turns the convert not only from himself, but from the world, as it is, towards better things. First comes self, disregard than service than this reconstructive creative energy. For the finer sort of mind, this aspect of religion seems always to have been its primary attraction. One has to remember that there is a real will for religion scattered throughout mankind, a real desire to get away from self. Religion has never persuaded its distinctive votaries, they have come to meet it. The desire to give oneself to greater ends than the everyday life affords and to give oneself freely is clearly dominant in that minority and traceable in an incalculable proportion of the majority. But hitherto religion has never been presented simply as devotion to a universal cause. The devotion has always been in it, but it has been complicated by other considerations. The leaders in every great religious movement have considered it necessary that it should explain itself in the form of history and a cosmogony. It has been felt necessary to say why and to what end. Every religion, therefore, has to adopt the physical conceptions and usually also to assume many of the moral and social values current at the time of its formation. It could not transcend the philosophical phrases and attitudes that seemed then to supply the natural frame for a faith, nor draw upon anything beyond the store of scientific knowledge of its time. In this lurk the seeds of the ultimate decay and suppression of every successful religion. But as the idea of continual change, going farther and farther from existing realities and never returning to them, is a new one, as nobody until very recently has grasped the fact that the knowledge of today is the ignorance of tomorrow, each fresh development of religion in the world so far has been proclaimed in perfect good faith as the culminating and final truth. This finality of statement is considerable immediate practical value. The suggestion of the possibility of further replacement is an unsettling suggestion. It undermines conviction and breaks the ranks of the believers. Because there are enormous varieties in the capacities of men to recognize the same spirit under a changing shape, these varieties cause endless difficulties today. While some intelligences can recognize the same God under a variety of names and symbols without any severe strain, others cannot even detect the most contrasted gods, one from the other, provided they wear the same mask and title. It appears a very perfectly natural and reasonable thing to many minds to restate religion now in terms of biological and psychological necessity, while to others any variation, whether in the phrasing of faith, seems to be nothing less than an atheistic misrepresentation of the most damnable kind. For these latter God, a God still anthropomorphic enough to have a will and a purpose to display preferences and reciprocate emotions, to be indeed in person, must be retained until the end of time. For others, God can be thought of as the great first cause, as impersonal and inhuman as atomic structure. It is because of the historical and philosophical commitments they have undertaken, and because of concessions made to common human weakness in regard to such once apparently minor but now vital moral issues as property, mental activities, and public veracity, rather than of any inadequacy in their adaptation to psychological needs. That the present wide discredit of organized religions has come about. They no longer seem even roughly truthful upon issues of fact, and they can give no imperatives, offer large field of conduct in which perplexity is prevalent. People will say, I could be perfectly happy leading the life of a Catholic devotee if only I could believe. But most of the framework of religious explanation upon which this life is sustained is too old-fashioned and too irrelevant to admit of that thoroughness of belief which is necessary for the devotion of intelligent people. Great ingenuity has been shown by modern writers and thinkers in the adaptation of venerable religious experiences to new ideas. Have I not written of the creative will in humanity as God, the invisible King, and presented it in the figure of a youthful and adventurous finite God? The word God is in most minds so associated with the concept of religion that it is abandoned only with greatest reluctance. The word remains, though. The idea is continually attenuated. Respect for him demands that he should have no limitations. He is pushed further and farther from actuality, therefore he and his definitions become increasingly a bundle of negations until at last, in his role of the absolute, he becomes an entirely negative expression. While we can speak of good, say some can speak of God. God is the possibility of goodness, the good side of things. If the phrase in which the name God is used are to be abandoned, they argue religion will be left speechless before many occasions. Certainly there is something beyond the individual that is, and the world that is, on that we have already insisted as a characteristic of all religions. That persuasion is the essence of faith and the key to courage. But whether that is to be considered even from the most strenuous exercises in personification as a greater person or a comprehensive person is another matter. Personality is the last vestige of anthropomorphism. The modern urge to perceive veracity is against such concessions to traditional expression. On the other hand, there is in many fine religious minds a desire amounting almost to a necessity for objective definition so individualized as to be capable at least of a receptive consciousness, even if no definite response is conceded. One type of mind can't accept a reality in itself which another must project and dramatize before it can comprehend it and react to it. The human soul is an intricate thing which will not endure elucidation, when that passes beyond a certain degree of harshness and roughness. The human spirit has learnt love, devotion, obedience, and humility in relation to other personalities. And with difficulty, it takes the final step to transcend subordination from which the last shred of personality is stripped. In matters not immediately material, language has to work by metaphors. And through every metaphor carries its own particular risk of confusion. We cannot do without them. Great intellectual tolerance is necessary. Therefore, I cultivated this position to translate and retranslate from one metaphysical or emotional idiom to another if there is not to be a deplorable wastage of moral force in our world. Just now, I wrote Pichavi because I had written God, the Invisible King, but after all, I do not think it was so much a sin to use that phrase. God, the Invisible King, is an error of expression. If there is no sympathetic personal leader outside us, there is at least in us the attitude we should adopt towards a sympathetic personal leader. 3 profound differences between the new mental dispositions of the present time and those of the preceding ages have to be realized if current developments of the religious impulse are to be seen and their correct relationship to the religious life of the past. There have been a great advance in the analysis of psychic process and the courage with which men have probed into the origins of human thought and feeling. Following upon the biological advances that have made us recognize fish and amphibian in the bodily structures of man, have come these parallel developments in which we see elemental fear and lust and self-love molded, modified, and exalted under the stress of social progress. Into intricate human motives, our conception of sin and our treatment of sin have been profoundly modified by this analysis. Our former sins are seen as ignorances, inadequacies, and bad habits, and the moral conduct is robbed of 3/4 of its ego-centered melodramatic quality. We are no longer moved to be less wicked. We are moved to organize our conditioned reflexes and lead a life less fragmentary and silly. Secondly, the conception of individuality has been influenced and relaxed by biological thought, so that we do not think so readily of the individual contra mundum as our fathers did. We begin to realize that we are egoists by misapprehension. Nature cheats the self to serve the purpose of the species by filling it with wants that war against its private interests. As our eyes are open to these things, we see ourselves as beings greater or less than the definitive man. Man's soul is no longer his own. It is, he discovers, part of a greater being which lived before he was born and will survive him. The idea of survival of the definitive individual with all the accidents and idiosyncrasies of his temporal nature upon himself dissolves to nothing in this new view of immortality. The third of the main contrasts between modern and former thought, which have rendered the general shapes and established religion old-fashioned and unserviceable, is a reorientation of current ideas about time. The powerful disposition of the human mind to explain everything is the inevitable unfolding of a past event which, so to speak, sweeps the future hopelessly before it, has been checked by a mass of subtle criticisms. The conception of progress as a broadening and increasing purpose, a conception which is taking hold of the human imagination more and more firmly, turns religious life towards the future. We think no longer of submission to the irrevocable decrees of absolute dominion, but of participation and adventure on behalf of a power that gains strength and establishes itself. The history of our world, which has been unfolded to us by science, runs counter to all the histories on which the religions have been based. There was no creation in the past, we begin to realize, but eternally there is creation. There was no fall to account for the conflict of good and evil, but a stormy ascent. Life as we know it is a mere beginning. It seems unavoidable that if religion is to develop unifying and directive power in the present confusion of human affairs, it must adapt itself to this forward-looking individuality, analyzing turn of mind. It must divest itself of sacred histories, its gross preoccupations, its posthumous prolongation of personal ends, the desire for service, for subordination, for permanent effect, for an escape from the distressful pettiness and mortality of the individual life is the undying element in every religious system. The time has come to strip religion down to that, to strip it for the greater tasks than it has ever faced before. The histories and symbols that served our fathers encumber and divide us. Sacraments and rituals harbor disputes and waste our scanty emotions. The explanation of why things is an unnecessary effort in religion. The essential fact in religion is the desire for religion and not how it came about. If you do not want religion, no persuasions, no convictions about your place in the universe can give it to you. The first sentence in the modern creed must be not "I believe," but "I give myself." To what and how? To these questions we will now address ourselves. All right, that's all for tonight. We ended at chapter 6 here. We have a lot of people in the chat, so let's check that out. Corbin, hello. Hashimoan, hello. Prepare to Forge, hello. North Sea, hello. Let's see. The Imperator Forge. The 1930s or 20s seemed like a period when the Fabians were brutally honest about as to their goals. Yes. "3D Cal, hello. Oh, Record Demons, hello. Redacted Brainwaves, hello. All right. Tune in next week, Tuesday, for part 2 of the Oba Conspiracy, Chapter 6. Beginning with Chapter 6. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.